when Carol Muskie came and read at the first Ventura Poetry Festival, she read that poem of mine but that was a sweet gesture of hers. Poem. The Last Shaker of Canterbury, New Hampshire, dies in her sleep. And it's for Ethel Hudson, who was the last shaker at the little community in Canterbury, New Hampshire. And it's really interesting because Phil Taggart and I are friends with the poet Robert Peters, who wrote a wonderful collection of poems called A Garland for Sister Anne, which is a collection of poems about the woman who founded sort of the Shaker movement. And Robert actually had met Ethel Hudson, and he said, gosh, he said, in your poem, he said, you make her sound like a much more pleasant person than she was. And he told this funny little story about visiting them, and that one thinks of Shakers and simplicity, and he said that the house was cluttered. She was still living with two other Shaker women who had died at that time, and he said the house was full of smelly little dogs and sort of all this fussy gewgaws, I think he called them, or whatnots, or things, and things all over. And he just remembered the smelly, nippy little dogs and these sort of unpleasant old women. But when I read the obit in the paper, which kind of inspired the poem, I had this was a woman I didn't know, so I had no reason, and this was before Robert telling me that anecdote, that I had no reason to think any differently about her, and I was very much attracted by the idea that she was the last. And I think Americans, more than any other group of people in the world, are more interested in lists and things that are first and last and whatever that obsession is. And so what I did was that I took a quote from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and it's from the prologue, "The holy blissful martyr for to seek." And so I tried to imagine what it was like. And a lot of people don't realize that the Shakers were a celibate group of individuals, that when people professed the Shaker faith, they then became celibate. And one of the ways that the Shakers continued to bring converts in was that they, at a time in history when it was a rarity, they actually were responsible for creating probably one of the most humane orphanage type systems, and it was that they would adopt children out of orphanages and raise them, and then as these children reached the age of accountability and they're around puberty, those children could choose to be Quaker or Shaker or not. Not Quaker, Shaker. They could choose to be Shakers or not. And Ethel Hudson herself, I knew, had been adopted, and she was one of these children that was taken in and raised by these people, and then professed that religious belief. And I imagine her talking. So this is all fiction, but it's me imagining Ethel Hudson talking about some of that. The Last Shaker of Canterbury, New Hampshire, dies in her sleep. At 96, I still dream like a schoolgirl. Short autumnal afternoons full of arithmetic and the smoke of leaves and corn stubble burned into ash, to be turned into the soil before the ground freezes. Sister Anne peeling apples behind the stove, long fragrant curls of Jonathan and wine sap. Sister Margaret wore a starched cap of muslin, transparent as the skin a snake left on the garden wall. She was mistress of the laundry, severe at times, but allowed us orphans to play at tag among the sheets on the clothesline. How they fluttered and billowed like the sails of ships or great white birds held captive. Was I a captive here? Surely I was love's captive, not wanting anything which could not be shared by all. What is the point of a good pie if no one eats it? We were all God's captives, and he required of us a song. With the song, joyful work with our hands, and at the end of the day, rest. At the end of all my days, rest. This is a poem entitled Emmaus, which is the name of a town in the New Testament in the book of Luke. And it is a story of one of the post-resurrection stories. And I took that town, that story, and rewrote it to express a certain feeling of loss about my brother's death, although in truth, when the poem started, it wasn't about my brother who had died a few years before, but then he sort of appeared in the poem, and I decided to leave it be. And the poem is this. I was on the road to Emmaus. Excuse me, I'll have to start again. He overtook me on the road to Emmaus, and we walked together, discussing what better path I might have taken, given the lay of the land, whether or not the pass was closed. He so favored my dead brother, I asked him to supper. And he said yes. The light, it seemed, followed us home, where he sat beside me at the table. I turned and reached for a plate of figs, turned back to his empty chair. What did I expect in that chill autumnal air? My work is very often characterized, when I write about my experiences growing up in southern Appalachia, are often those stories are sometimes a mixture of recovered memory and fiction, and certainly in deference to people that I grew up with, that I don't use the real names, but I do use historical place names. But when it comes to the names of people, I go ahead and make up names to protect, I guess, both the living and the dead. This is a poem entitled Back Home Story, which appears in Shenandoah, which is a literary journal from Washington and Lee University in Virginia. A journal that I have been trying to get published in for at least 2 decades, and they finally took some work. Back Home Story. One summer when I was in college, I worked with Linda Sanook from Little Snowbird over in Graham County. She was dating a man from Robbinsville, old enough to be her father. He drove a truck and picked Linda up for long lunches, from which she returned with her hair all messed up. My friend Charlie called the man a squaw shyster on account of Linda being Cherokee. By the end of summer, Linda was pregnant and not married, so she fixed things by drowning herself down at Hanging Dog, just where the bridge crosses the tip end of the lake. Leastways, that's what Charlie told me the last time I was in town. Which, as it so happens, was the last time I saw Charlie. About a month later, he got in a knife fight down in Ellijay, where some big Georgia cracker cut him good and deep on the inside of his leg, up near his privates. Nicked an artery. Charlie bled out in the back of his friend's truck on the way to get help in Blue Ridge. That same friend told me that all Charlie could say was, oh God, that son of a bitch cut me. Not the kind of last words Charlie's mama, or anybody else for that matter, would want on a headstone. Two more poems that I'm going to read draw on some of those memories growing up in Appalachia. One which is I refer to sometimes as sort of as a dream poem, in that world of dreams where just about anything is possible. And this was a poem that I wrote because I had my father had died when I was 10 years old. So I didn't have a lot of real clear memories of him, but he was a veteran of World War II, and he fought in the Pacific Theater. And I know that he was drafted shortly after Pearl Harbor was bombed, and that he left early in 1942, and that my mother did not see him again until 46. He was hospitalized in a military hospital after the war for what was known as shell shock at that time. And the fact that my father had a third grade education made me realize that there really wasn't any correspondence between them. And I had often wondered what those years were like with my father gone for about 4 years and no communication between these two people. And when he had left, my mother was pregnant with my sister. So she gave birth, and those early years, you know, my sister was about 4 when my father saw her for the first time, or was actually, I think, over 4 years old when my father saw her. And I thought about that, what that separation may have been like. And the only way that I could think about approaching it was through the language of dreams. And this was one poem in a series of poems at that time that I was trying to write about that relationship and that separation. And I do recall that my mother at one time had said that the only thing that my father had said about being shipped out was that Texas was the only place that he knew of where one could ride a train all day and all night and be in the same place. And that was sort of the trigger for this poem. And so I imagine that my father wrote that rather than said it. Sleeping Through Texas. In 1942, on his way to the Pacific War, my father wrote, "Texas is the only place where you can ride a train all day and all night and still be in the same place. Write if you can." My mother did not write back. It was a hot summer. Most families had lost a baby or two to diphtheria or whooping cough. She slept with her baby and dreamed. The window on the train was open. Blackberry briars grew in through the windows. She took the baby's sailor cap, filling it with berries until her fingers were sore from thorns and stained as dark as the felt rose pinned to her mother's dress, borrowed for this trip. She unwrapped a sandwich from waxed paper as the train pulled up through the gorge. She was thirsty. The waterfall looked like milk in the distance. The baby laughed. She dreamed she was a widow. Having left the baby with her people, she rode west for news of the war. A sparrow flew through the Pullman with a telegram in its beak. At the depot, a young man in patched trousers waited near the baggage car. He favored her husband. She waved, but he disappeared, as people do in dreams. Somewhere a band with uniforms faded by years in the sun struck up a martial air. Or was it a waltz? Swifts had nested in the tuba and flew back and forth with ribbons and scraps of paper. Is the war over? Someone asks. My mother doesn't know. Her mouth is dry, and she has misplaced her black straw hat. A conductor awakens her, punches her ticket. Where are we? She asks. Why, ma'am, this is Texas. No place but. All of this is a dream, too. It will be years before she is a widow. One of her babies will die, but not when she expects it. This war will end only to be replaced by another, and her life will be what she makes of it, stitched together like a quilt with an intricate pattern which covers her, a life that she could never have imagined. The last poem that I'll read, which is sort of a series of poems of growing up in the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina, is entitled Kites. And when I was a child, store-bought kites were a luxury, and I think I recall that I may have had one of those or two of them as a child, but we made our own kites, and the absolute best paper for homemade kites was the butcher paper from the butcher shop. And at that time in my hometown, the butcher was a gentleman by the name of Bertie Harden. Bertie wasn't his real name. That was his nickname, but truth is I don't recall what Mr. Harden's real name was, so he is relegated in my memory to Bertie. But Bertie gave my sister enough butcher paper to make a kite, and she and a neighbor boy who was about her age were really good at making kites that weren't too heavy, that could actually fly. And this is a recollection of a memory of one of those very successful kites. And we lived in there were a cluster of houses in a row that had belonged to an old tannery. And so when I talk about row houses, I'm not talking about row houses as one might imagine them in England. These were actual separate houses, but they were in a row, and there were 2 rows of them. Kites. And this is for Buddy Ledford, my sister Maxine Wheeler Conley, and Buddy's mother, who was Pinky. Pinky's son, Buddy, had been at it for over 2 hours, standing in the field not yet turned for seed, the butcher paper kite aloft, a white speck against big Stamp Mountain. 3 families from the row houses turned out into the March wind to watch his homemade acrobat spin and dido toward the growing dark. Hold him, Buddy, I'll get more string. 200 more feet of string took the kite like a prayer closer to heaven. We could have all stood there, I think, forever. This kite, now the word made visible. Buddy played it out. The string bowed out and up like some filament of Jacob's ladder. Everybody laughed and clapped their hands. When the string broke, my mother allowed that the kite might make it to Tennessee. Who knows where it went? Buddy cussed, cried, and finally got tired of winding string. What happiness his kite carried with it did not return, and children with wind-raw ears turned back to home, fresh cakes of cornbread, beans on the stove, and more talk of the kite that Buddy made. They would all sleep warm tonight and fashion kites in their dreams, kites to reel back in, kites that break free.